Hello and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on adverse media screening, how to cut exposure to criminal activity from money laundering to human trafficking. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor at A-Team Group and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Justine Gazowska, Director of Illicit Finance Policy at the Century, Ted Datter, Head of Financial Crime Compliance Practice Europe and Africa at Bureau van Dijk, a Moody's Analytics company, and Eric Morgan, Global KYC and Due Diligence Executive. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a minute, but first just a few notes for you. To the right of your video screen, you'll see a panel for polls and questions. We'll be running 3 polls through the webinar, so please do vote so that we can get some idea of what you're thinking on some of the topics we'll be discussing. In the question panel, you can put any questions you would like to put to the speakers, and those will reach me, and I will ask our experts just as many of them as we can. So please keep putting those there. We won't save them to the end, otherwise we won't get to them. So put them in when you want to, and I'll put as many as I can to the speakers. That's enough of me. So let me come to the speakers. And Justina, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Hello to everybody, and thanks for having me. Thanks to A Group and Bureau van Dijk. So I'm Justina Gazowska. I'm the Director of Illicit Finance Policy at the Century. For those of you not familiar with the Century, it is an investigative policy nonprofit that follows the dirty money connected to African war criminals and transnational war profiteers, and seeks to shut those benefiting from violence out of the international financial system. So basically, we are a producer of adverse media, and we hope that you read our reports, and so that you know not only what the Century knows, but also what the regulators know, because we know that they do read our reports. So it's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, Ted.
Yeah, hi, Sarah. Yeah, pleasure likewise to be here. I think we're joined by over 1,000 registrants, which is great. As you mentioned in the introduction, I head up our financial crime practice for Europe and Africa. So practitioners and former regulators and advisors in the space, helping our customer base to really deploy effectively data and technology to enable and accelerate the detection of financial crime risk. Yeah, great topic today to talk to in detail. Look forward to discussion, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Eric.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me to the A-Team and also BBD. I've got a lot of experience in the banking industry and space, and my voice here is going to be to try to add a pragmatic element into what we're discussing to help you achieve your goals in this area.
Excellent. Thank you all very much indeed. So let's move on to our conversation. And Ted, coming to you first and sort of setting the scene, what is the required scope of adverse media coverage for regulated and non-regulated firms, and to what extent is it expanding?
Thanks, Sarah. That sounds a simple, straightforward question, doesn't it? But it isn't, and it's probably one that lends itself to a bit of early discussion. I think the way that our customers approach this when we talk and think about it with them is probably there's two areas to think about in terms of your approach when deploying an adverse media capability. The first is the regulatory expectation. Take a good example of that in money laundering. We've seen enhancements across the EU with firstly the 5th money laundering directive, closely followed by the 6th that was to be implemented and fully implemented early this year, and future harmonization potentially with the EU rulebook coming in next 2 or 3 years. Within that scope, there are predicate crimes. So the idea that if some of your customers or potential customers have red flags on their file that indicate they are performing activities connected to areas like human trafficking, which is obviously one of the big topics today, then there's a direct line to correlate to money laundering, which is an enabler and an outcome of that activity. Therefore, there are reporting obligations if you screen and address those red flags. So from a regulatory standpoint, we're seeing that closing of the gap. We'll touch into it as well when we talk about sanctions compliance and how there's intersection and convergence there, which is another major area. From the other dimension, then, is the reputational angle. And really with reputation, it's ultimately about financial loss. So, where you see reputation risk, you see share price, you see damage to brand, intellectual property value of your company. And that's across a far broader spectrum of market participants beyond those firms which are regulated. So major multinationals, for example, who have a huge amount of brand value. And we'll talk about that, I think, in a second in terms of how far to go. But there is this idea, historically, people have called it the newspaper test. It's probably a bit old-fashioned. It's probably more the Twitter test these days. But if you were to see something about your firm in a reputable publication, what would the impact be on your consumers, your customers, and your third parties and suppliers that choose to work with you? So those are the questions that our customers are asking, and is an increasing broader set of customers asking those questions of us.
Okay, that's great. So Eric, coming to you to add to that, what would you say in terms of how much there is and how much more there is to come?
Yeah, I think everything that's been said is spot on. I think from the standpoint of an organization, the key here is working through your risk methodology, risk framework, and importantly, the risk appetite of the organization, and making sure that that's understood across the organization. And this is one element of that. It's an important key element, but it's making sure that you're knitting together the various elements within the organization and how they approach them, and making sure that the organization understands that.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. And Justina, bringing you in here, Ted talked a little bit about regulatory requirements for screening, and how detailed is that screening, and what should people sort of be doing in this space?
So as a general matter, as already has been touched upon by Ted and Eric, regulators as well as the FATF require a risk-based approach to AML-CFT compliance, and a compliance program that is designed and tailored to the risks of your business, of your institution. And as part of the risk-based approach, financial institutions need to develop risk profiles for their customers and understand the risks that emanate from their customers. You have to understand your customer in order to be able to see if anything is suspicious. If you don't know your customer, don't know her business, how can you tell if something is out of the ordinary? How can you file a SAR? So adverse media screening at account opening and an ongoing basis, as Eric said, is one of the tools that can help you do that. It is a key tool, and it is a tool that regulators have come to expect be utilized, especially when you're doing EDD. How detailed it needs to be really depends on two factors. As Eric said, it is your risk profile as well as your risk appetite. You have to find that happy middle between those two factors. If your institution only has domestic customers and deals with plain vanilla brokerage products, you may want to exclude certain types of alerts from your negative news screenings, and you may not need to screen quite as often. If you're dealing with emerging markets or have a very low risk appetite, your compliance program might look totally different. So regulators don't prescribe any particular type of screening or frequency, but they do require a compliance program that is able to identify and mitigate risk. And depending on the size and risk profile of your institution, most regulators have really come to expect adverse media screening to be part of it. Ted mentioned the newspaper test. I'll mention the smell test. Think about if a regulator comes in and you don't do negative news screening, will that really pass the smell test?
Okay, thank you very much. And coming to you, Ted, what would you add there? You mentioned some regulation in our first question.
Yeah, I echo those points. And there's a couple of interesting things. Think about that risk assessment that the organization does, thinking about your inherent risk. When practitioners look at this, there is the product and channels that you're servicing. So a good example is trade finance. We saw a letter about a week ago by the FCA here in the UK and the PRA talking about lack of detailed risk assessments, the challenges around identification of the parties involved in trade finance, and adverse media screening was called out as a component of a good program, because as people that live in that trade finance world know that that's a very challenging area of understanding transactions in almost real time, documentation, who the end consumer is, considerations around trade-based money laundering, dual use goods. So you see it more in these, or you see it in the specific thematic approaches that the regulators take, where there are business models which are, because you can see, challenging. The other area I would say is with the digital acceleration that we've had in the last year and a half. The questions that people are now asking themselves are also about how susceptible our business is to things like fraud and new fraud models with a fully online transaction process, for example. And those sorts of questions, again, when you're asking them during your fraud risk assessment, thinking about your products that you sell, the channels that you service, the jurisdictions you operate in, then again, what type of screening are we doing? Are we doing a tuned adverse media screening which can identify fraud? That's a really important area. Also always has been, of course, but we see now that acceleration in terms of, certainly from a remote world, digital operating models, that screening and what we can see in adverse media becoming increasingly important, and effectively underlined in the guidance that's been issued in recent weeks from the UK regulators here.
Okay, thank you, Ted. And staying with you, tell us a little bit about how adverse media screening and due diligence intersect with other financial crime obligations, such as sanctions compliance programs and so on. And I think you have a couple of case studies to show us here, which show the complexity, but what needs to be done. Let's have a look. Lovely, thanks.
I do indeed, thank you for that. Yeah, so we see, if we take, taking sanctions itself could take the rest of this 48 minutes that we have, and I know Justina has previous role experience of just how specific and prescriptive sanction due diligence is. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is from a sort of regulatory context, the UK here, obviously diversion from Europe, and following in line with the US from a sanctions footing to issue designations and create grounding for designations for broader sets of risk factors. So the UK's human rights sanctions, or global human rights sanctions last year, under that there are grounding for designations under areas such as rights to life, prohibition of rights to not be subjected to torture, and free from slavery. So the extent and the context for designations in a sanctions footing is broadening. What does that mean from a due diligence and screening? Well, this is an interesting case study. So this is Min Yang. He is de facto Prime Minister and not coincidentally, the leading of the military in Myanmar. And you can see a sort of timeline here. This is taken from GRID, our risk intelligence and adverse media data set. So here from 2018 is picked up in a local news report for being probed, so fairly early stage in the probative cycle for potential human rights and war crimes, so under investigation. So a good adverse media surveillance technology and tool will be monitoring, structuring, classifying, giving you dates around when these things happen and the input of that and the output to you. So how probative, what stage of the cycle. So from that early capturing of his profile as a known potential bad actor, depending on your view, I mean, clearly human rights genocide is a serious topic. But we can see that sort of timeline up to almost current present day from April earlier this year, where he was specifically designated under the UK's jurisdiction as we rolled out sanctions against the regime because of persecution of Rohingya Muslims. So an interesting case study out of that early warning that adverse media can give people to be on the front foot. When a sanction comes out, there is a fire drill in an organization and they want to really quickly know, do we have this customer anywhere in our organization? So adverse media with these intersections can give you that front foot approach. The the next case study, if you're the pan to that, is a similar, it's just the other side of the pond. So this is Vasyl Boshkov. We can see here the OFAC, US Office of Foreign Asset Control, that designate their sanctions. He is a named individual. That's the most recent, very similar. An SDN, a specially designated national, and that's from June of this year. Now, the US global Magnitsky sanctions has a similar footing, anti-corruption, anti-human rights. So he has been designated under that program. But you can see for about a year before, local Bulgarian news agency capturing the story of him. And he's an interesting and colourful character. I won't spend the rest of the time talking about him, but you can see that early warning of that from an adverse media perspective would put him as would you onboard that customer? If you did or had onboarded that customer, would you offboard that customer? And if you had offboarded that customer, then you wouldn't be at a point of having to do a fire drill from a sanctions perspective. So we see that trend increasing. I'd say designations become broader, it's something we see almost on a weekly basis here. So I think some good case studies to share with the audience.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting, fascinating case studies. Thank you, Ted. And coming to you, Eric, what would you say in terms of sort of pulling it all together so you get the kind of picture that Ted was talking about?
So I think what's really important is everyone looks in their organization and makes sure that the organization understands what their risk appetite means and how to effectively apply it. So you need to make sure that operationally the processes align to the procedures. You need to make sure that the individuals undertaking the activities know what's expected and why and how those activities should be done. And they need to understand the risk appetite and why their actions and activities impact that, in addition to how they impact that. If they don't understand that, it's very, very difficult to read some information on an individual or a company in a jurisdiction that may or may not have negative impact on your organization. And to make that value judgment, individuals in the organization need to be able to knit back what activities are being undertaken, what they're doing, and how that fits back to their risk tolerance or risk framework. It's also exceptionally important that you don't bite off more than you can chew. So if you try to screen your entire client base and all related parties, and you don't have the operational capability to complete that, or the know-how or wherewithal to be able to achieve that, including escalations, you need to make sure that the worst thing that can happen is you have information that you've been sitting on and haven't acted. And you should make sure that the organization understands that maybe you're doing slightly less screening, or you aren't screening your entire client base, maybe only medium and high risk, but everyone knows the actions and activities that need to take place should there be a hit, or if there's a potential sanctions breach, who to escalate to, i.e. the sanctions team, and what is expected to come out of that. And often there's a belief that we'll have very robust policies and procedures, and there's an inability or an unwillingness to look at the operational achievability of that. And if you put one above the other, it will fail, and it will be brought up as a very obvious shortcoming in your organization.
Okay, thank you. Justina, what would you say there in terms of all the integration that's required?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ted's slides are really music to my ears because, my experience now at the Century and previously at a global bank, and prior to that at Treasury, when I was at OFAC, we were always quite surprised about how surprised the private sector was about certain sanctions designations. And we always felt that there were early warning signs that someone might be sanctioned in the future if you just paid attention. And I think the case studies that Ted showed really drive that point home. So I think sanctions compliance, adverse media screening is really an integral component of sanctions compliance. And as sanctions compliance officers, we're always expected to, do the, horizon gazing, the crystal ball gazing to see what might be coming next. And the negative news, especially with the rise of anti-corruption sanctions, human rights sanctions, it offers those clues so that you can extricate yourself from a client before that client becomes sanctioned. I have an example from the work of the century. We wrote a big report on someone named Al Cardinal, a South Sudanese tycoon, corrupt tycoon. He was subsequently sanctioned by the US under its GLOMAG authorities, and then by the UK in the first round of its anti-corruption sanctions program. So again, this could have been something that was predictable had you paid attention.
Okay, that's great. Let's move on, but let's take an audience poll first. The question is, what are the challenges of adverse media screening at your organization? You can tick as many of the boxes as you feel are appropriate. And while you select your answers, let me come back to Justina to talk about those challenges for financial firms as volumes and regulatory scrutiny continue to rise. This one's for you, Justina, I think. Yeah.
So I think the biggest challenge is what Eric alluded to, is just the sheer volume of the information and making sure that you're able to operationalize that information, because you don't want a regulator coming in and seeing you've been sitting on there's some information in a file that no one has acted on it, that you have it, but you haven't done anything about it. So that's really the worst case scenario. It's almost better not to have it. So it's really about picking out the wheat from the chaff. That is difficult. You have garbage data, you're monitoring more perhaps than traditional media. You could be monitoring social media. Sometimes it's difficult to pick out the nuance. I had talked to a colleague from my prior job before doing this, and she had mentioned that articles from The Onion sometimes appear in negative news alerts. So just picking out what really matters and what is noise, I think, is the most difficult part, and really having someone look at that information and make the judgment.
Okay. Ted, what would you say to that? How do you see the key challenges?
I would have to talk about the tools, really, as well as the operational challenges is there. I think it's kind of what came first, the legacy technology or the overwhelming noise, and the distraction of free search engines, right? I mean, it's so easy for people to build a search string in a search engine and think that that's solving a problem. And many major organizations do that. And I'm not saying that's not part of the solution, but to think that's the solution is a challenge. We probably won't go into the depths of that, but there's lots of issues there. The structuring of the data is the big one. So where to start, the sources, the inclusion criteria, the classification, the languages, is it being translated or not? So just looking for partners that are thinking that way, and we'll get more into that, I think, as we progress through. You've got, the table stakes of being able to say from a sort of, big three things, source, scale, and language. Does it have, or are you looking at enough? And then calibrating that to the point earlier about risk assessments. Are you doing a simplified or a fairly standard due diligence? That's fine. Are you looking at a forensic case for enhanced due diligence where maybe you do want technology which connects to social, but you probably don't want social in your first pass of CDD or for looking at your supply chain when you've got tens of thousands. So knowing what the inherent risks that we've spoken about is really important. And I know we'll get more into the tech and some of those beyond the kind of just fundamentals that I've outlined there in terms of what these tools need to have. But I do think there is this challenge of the distraction of free search engines, being able to look at various bits and pieces. So that I think is a consideration when thinking about what a good vendor looks like and how it differentiates from that.
Okay, that's great. Eric, let's stay with you and maybe see the poll results, please. And Eric, perhaps you would like to Ooh, comment on these. Top challenge, manual processing. Next, huge volumes, as we mentioned, unstructured data, fake news, accurate customer data. What would you say to that, Ted? Does that look familiar?
Yeah, I think a manual processing. Yeah, I mean, this is an industry that's blighted, as we know, by false positives, and it is media that's the biggest area, because there's the discretionary element, how far to go. I'm sure we'll get into that in terms of helping some of those, and the volumes absolutely are a challenge just to be able to wade through those. And like I say, lots of people, the majority of people probably filling this in are using tools that are probably keyword driven, which is legacy, quite frankly. So that is an output of what we're seeing here of the challenges of people knowing where to start and dealing with the amount of results to get back.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. We've got quite a few audience questions in, so let's touch on a couple of those for a minute, if we may. And the first one, let me come back to you again, Ted. It says financial crime or fraud, etc., is obviously something firms are looking for using adverse media screening, but what else should they be looking for, and how easy is it to find? You've mentioned a certain amount of things, but can you just run a list or tell us where people can find a list of the things they should be looking for?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Sarah. What was the?
Yeah. Well, as well as looking for financial crime, what else should people be looking for when they're scanning their media screening?
Yeah, correct. I mean, so I think where we're seeing this a lot of, if you look at the direction of travel for supply chain due diligence, for example, again, an EU directive in the works sooner than later with local national legislation. There is the spectrum of knowing your supplier and third party, and across indices like the regulatory risks that we've spoken about, from a reputation risk, environmental crime, for example. We then think about things like cyber, which is a massive area, and we're making capabilities available there to our customers to look at potential for losses and risks. We look at ESG with a lot of interest, and trying to sort of practically deploy that for our customers at scale. For screening their suppliers is an area that we're actively working with. So there is an increasing range of risk topics under the Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Procurement Officer's remit, and they're just some of those that screening adverse media can open up for you. Okay,
so when we're talking about human rights and things like that, we're talking about people trafficking, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I know we call out human trafficking. I mean, it's the thread that runs through. If you look where the direction of travel, UK has been a trailblazer. Australia's probably gone a bit further recently. The German supply chain bill is landing, and like I say, it's a forward into the European directive coming next year. Human trafficking, modern slavery, human rights, that's the theme. That's the call to action, and it really is the modern slavery angle that's pulling across. So being able to screen on those keywords, looking at that area, great, but also we'll get into the technology about the relevancy and filtering, but articles that are tagged, content that's verified, and the sources, it's absolutely vital to get ahead of that legislation and be compliant to it where it's already in effect.
Okay, fine. And sorry, Ted, I got to come back to you because you just mentioned it. The next question: how much of media screening is also now done with regards to ESG? You mentioned environmental and ESG. A lot of screening in that space.
Yeah, it depends what your output is. If you're looking for benchmarks, which is a big area within an ESG, versus you're looking to do due diligence and dive deeper, if that makes sense. So a lot of what people are looking for early in these areas is benchmarks, so how comparative performance of customers and suppliers for an investment or a third-party relationship, versus the deeper dive. In a deeper dive, all the three letters are each things that you want to go into. So for environmental crime, think about social, so labour, forced labour violations. Those topics become areas, and I'm sure Justina can talk to some of those, the work the Centre is doing. So yeah, there's kind of the broad portfolio approach of I need to benchmark and then dive deeper into, okay, these are my heat mapped areas of concern. And that's where you're looking through articles for help on what does that output initially look like and what does it mean to us.
Okay, Justina, would you like to add there about ESG? Is that a big thing now in screening?
Yeah, I think we can't work in silos and look at sanctions, look at AML, CFT, and look at ESG, because they're becoming really interconnected, especially ESG and sanctions. When you're looking at forced labor, entities have been sanctioned for forced labor issues. When you're looking at human rights issues. So I think it's difficult now to just silo these things. You have to really look at them holistically, because there's increasingly an interconnectedness and convergence of these themes.
Okay, that's great. I have a couple of questions asking if it would be possible to see BVD's adverse media solution in practice, but I don't think we can do that today because we haven't prepped for that.
For the next half an hour, it's fine. We'll just
exactly. Well, let's see how we go. But for all of you who've asked that question, please use the contact at the end of the webinar. You'll see a contact, or alternatively, send us your real names, not anonymous, and we'll gather them up and send them over to Ted, and he'll be able to help you with that. So please do let us know who you are. We won't share it, obviously, and we'll pass them on to Ted. Fine. Let's get back to the business of our questions, and coming to you, Eric. What are the key components of solutions that can resolve all these challenges and help firms avoid regulatory breaches and reputational damage?
Well, silver bullet. I think the biggest solution is stepping back and making sure the organization understands what they're supposed to be doing in this area. You would be surprised the number of disjointed, misunderstood elements that we've been talking about that organizations are finally realizing that they're related. Most big financial institutions were fully aware that these elements were related a decade plus ago. However, the application of bringing that together operationally within the organization is where the organizations kept tripping up, falling over themselves, basically. Having huge amounts of data that they couldn't effectively process. And I'll give you some examples. You may have a integrated onboarding system that tracks various members, let's say anyone who holds over 20% for a high risk entity in a private company. And that person's name hypothetically is John Doe. The ability to keep track of that John Doe versus the hundreds or thousands of other John Does within the organization that may or may not be the same person or related parties is key. And that amount of data is just being magnified by all of the screening that's happening, because not only do you have to determine whether or not the hit is actually hit according to your risk appetite and your tolerances, but you have to determine whether that hit is actually on the John Doe that you have in your books. And the combination of those elements, a lot of organizations haven't worked through yet. And they're trying to solve one aspect of the problem without stepping back and solving the whole problem. And the key element is obviously a significant data cleanup, making sure that there's an understanding of the tools that you're using, and making sure that the individuals using those tools understand why they're using them, how they're using them, and the end result of what they're trying to do. And that basic understanding is what will make a huge step forward in resolving some of these issues. Of course, not all of them, but the silly issues that keep coming up again and again and again.
Okay, thanks. I think we'd probably all agree with that. And let's run another poll question while we're here. And it is, how satisfied is your organization with its adverse media screening? So while you select your answer, let me come back to you, Eric, to talk a little bit about best practice approaches firms can take to assess their particular requirement and select a suitable solution, and how these solutions can be integrated with all the other things that they already have.
Okay, so the first thing I would do is make sure your data is in a state that when it's put into this process, it can be used. And that you aren't through the back door cleaning up your data as you start integrating new systems, which is unfortunately usually what happens. And that in and of itself can cause a massive disruption. The second thing is making sure that the technology, that you get the bells and whistles that are applicable to you as an organization and mean something to you and your risk methodology, your approach to the customers. You may have a tool that can do much more than you need, and that sounds great, but your ability to actually process that information or use that effectively is impaired. And you need to make sure that whatever you're using, you understand, and the people who are doing it understand it, and that it's effectively used. It's better to have something that's maybe lacking a few bells or a few whistles, but is effectively used. And then make sure that you sit down and work through how this maps out to your risk appetite. Make sure that your risk appetite is revalidated, probably on an annual basis at least, and making sure that any regulatory changes or any other legal changes that may come into play are included in that. So I think if you have appropriate governance in the risk space and appropriate operational effectiveness, the two combined should be able to at least stop the bleeding in this space. It may not fix all of the problems, but it will start you on the road to fixing the problems.
Thank you, Eric. And Ted, what sort of best practice approaches would you suggest here and how to select solutions and so on?
Yeah, okay, so we're talking a bit more practically about selecting and technology and data. And Eric's absolutely nailed that. I mean, well, you see a problem in the market with, and we'll talk about machine learning probably in a second, but it actually has the adverse impact of amplifying bad data and creating a whole host of issues. So from a data management perspective, it's absolutely core that the entity data, the related party data that you're then pushing through whatever tech, and we'll talk about that in a second about new tools, AI, machine learning, etc. But having a foundational set of data, resolving that single customer view as best as possible, and then understanding on the third party data side, as Eric's talked to, how is that third party conducting name matching? What principles are embedded? Beyond pure name matching, where we're seeing and where we've made developments in the last couple of years here is sort of two elements. There's the name matching, which is a huge challenge because there are, unfortunately, we're not all date time stamped, nor are we all recorded by a number. So there's always going to be a challenge with the scale of billions of data points. So name matching is absolutely important. That's a lot of understanding your vendor, how they've done it historically, have they got people who's experienced in language transliteration, reversal, are they really continually investing in skills and individuals who know that, speak the language and can embed that into their technology. And then the second component of that to resolve a lot of this noise, the poll question is relevancy. So is a profile of adverse media relevant? And there's a dimension to that, which is our risk-based approach, true, as an organization, but there should be some onus on your vendor to think about that, right? So they work with this stuff day in, day out. They've got expertise in structuring these unstructured news blogs and great content that people like the Century produce. But how about making some determination on what's risk relevant? Because you're going to get a profile. If you put Apple into a search engine, you put BMW into a search engine, you're going to get a lot of stuff about their products or about a car crash. Or Apple as a name is pretty generic and it means lots of things. So the analyst's job is to work a task queue and to help that analyst, it's about prioritization of what they should look at first. So where we've made lots of strides is combining that name matching, accuracy and continual improvement with a relevancy. And relevancy comes from doing lots of work for customers, understanding the profiles, and it's humans, right? So it's analysts in the loop, but analysts that are documenting the decisions, auditable decisions that can train models. And we'll go into that in the technology in a second, but really it's important to think with your partner, what does their roadmap look like? How are they addressing those problems? And have they got the plan and the vision to help you as you scale this?
Okay, that's great. And let's have a look at the poll results, if we may. Thank you very much indeed. And Ted, I'm going to come back to you with this one. How satisfied are you with your adverse media screening?
Not a ringing endorsement, is it, for what people are? I mean, I don't know if it's just about satisfied. It's interesting. We need to get the global makeup, whether it's a European audience, that's probably a good thing. if it's a maybe US audience, then they're obviously really annoyed. Yeah, I mean, it is an unsatisfactory environment. It's, as all things we've spoken about, the challenges. I think a lot of it is incumbent on vendors to help frame this and provide tech and data that's usable and practicable. But also, as Eric's outlined, there's the frameworks in the organizations that need to be rigorously looked at, and the outcomes that people want from these screening tools to then do something with the information they get.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I hope some of our content today will be helpful to people who want to improve and enhance what they're doing. Let's go back and put up our last audience poll for today, which asks, to what extent is your organization using machine learning and/or artificial intelligence to support adverse media screening? So while you select your answer for that, it's back to Ted. This is turning into a bit of a one-man show, Ted. We'll have to end it soon. About technologies and tools that are becoming imperative to effective and efficient adverse media screening, and how particularly machine learning and AI are upping their game.
Yeah, I'm going to read a quote. So the FATF, Justina's mentioned them earlier, they published 2 really influential reports earlier this year. One about the promise of new tech for an AML CFT, and a sort of sister report equally as relevant about data pooling and collaboration analytics. They in the first report, the sort of exec summary says this: innovative technology-based solutions may contribute to financial inclusion as long as they're implemented through a responsible and risk-based approach, which we talked about earlier, articulated. They can minimize weaknesses in inconsistencies related to human control measures, improve customer experience, generate cost savings, and facilitate transaction monitoring. So I think each of those 4 points is themselves worth thinking about, but I think it's the first one around inconsistencies in human controls, with the scale of data from a media perspective, with the pressure on workload, and the fact that if you're a smaller organization and you're not structured in financial crime program, that you have designated watch list screening, PEP screening, sanction screening, you have leaders in all those groups, that then there's naturally a prioritization of the risk base of what we can screen. And to Eric's point earlier, you might just exclude the supply chain or some of your low risk customers because you simply can't handle the noise. Then it's really interesting to see that this, I'd say, innovation mandate is here. The FATF, as we know, from an effectiveness standpoint, within the guidelines, is hugely influential, but is starting to look at some of the things, for example, the UK FCA have done with global AML tech sprint a couple of years ago, with their regulatory sandboxes to nurture some of these tools through to production. But you're seeing this point where there is we can't continue on. We do need to look at new ways, and machine learning within that is a key area, of course, which we'll talk to a bit more. But I think we've reached that point of acceptance, and I'm interested in the other panelists' view of that. And then just on machine learning, I was involved here a couple of years ago in supervising a machine learning project. So that's an output of news articles and saying, are these relevant? Is the machine learning working? And there has to be your understanding again of the vendor. How have they trained that? How did they weed out the BMW car crash incident that I spoke of earlier, which doesn't really affect whether or not BMW is a reputable company. People crash cars, but it comes through news articles. So thinking about that, where are they on that? Fully supervised? Are they moving into environments where their models are reinforcing what model transfer protocols are involved? How does that get deployed in the institution? From a transfer learning and key explainability standpoint, these are really important things. But from an adverse media, it's a point where I don't think big institutions, they can't continue with the way they're working, and there's a real appetite to, I wouldn't say experiment, because it probably doesn't serve the financial crime community too well, but close to that, with using technologies to get better results. And today, for lots of people, it's just an unworkable thing.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed. And let's see the poll results. And Eric, perhaps you'd like to comment on these ones. Okay. What do you think? Sorry, can you see them? I know you're on a small screen.
I can see part of it. I'm on a small
Let me read it to you. Not at all, 53%. To some extent, it's to what extent is your organization using machine learning or AI for adverse media screening? 53% not at all, 28% to some extent, 13% to a great extent, 5% to a small extent, and 3% to the greatest extent possible. So
a comment on this that I think is important. I would hope that these results, that the people who are responding to them understand the systems that they're using, because a lot of the systems they're using probably do have elements of this, and they're unaware of that. So it goes back to my point, make sure you understand what you're using, what its capabilities are, and why you're using it and how. So I would be surprised, not at all. They may not be aware of it, but they may be using a number of systems that have elements of that. So I would have expected to some extent to be higher. In fact, I would have expected those two to be reversed, but it could be the case. It depends on the organizations that are responding, and it depends on their understanding of the technology that they're using. So not really surprising. I think we'll see more and more of that, obviously, but it goes back to the data. If we don't have data in a condition to make it useful, it's going to exacerbate the outcomes in a negative way, because we won't be able to determine which data is correct, which data isn't, and what the response should be. So hopefully that's not the case. But it may well be.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody, for voting. And let's come back to some audience questions. I have quite a few here. And one asks, what are the main challenges? And perhaps this one is for, I don't know, perhaps Ted, you'll find this easiest. What are the main challenges with existing adverse media technologies? Obviously, we just talked about ML and so on. Is it things like false positives, not enough coverage, integration, and things like that?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So scale, coverage, languages, how are you dealing with foreign language translation? And that's a key sort of basic principle. What jurisdictional coverage have you got? Source inclusion criteria, do you understand that? Have you got a statement from your vendor on how they work with that respect? That's if you are using a vendor versus public, free search engines that I've spoken to before. Keyword relevancies, so keywords, again, if I go back to that BMW crash, those two words are going to throw me an article about a BMW crash. It's going to be recorded negative unless there's any sentiment analysis or any natural language processing or any machine learning model that's got a relevancy indicator built into it. So they're the kind of fundamental challenges, and what you then get is a big backlog of work. Then you struggle to prioritize, then you're again naturally exposing yourself to areas where you're not able to screen them because of the amount of backlog of false positives you've got. So that then becomes cost negative, and the cycle is a challenge. So yeah, really understanding just the basic fundamentals of whatever tools you're using. I'm actually encouraged by that previous poll. If I read it another way, 47% are using some technology that has machine learning ingrained in that in some regard that they appreciate, which is good. But yeah, the basic challenges are, again, free stuff that people think is effective but actually is not effective, and then lots of applications that have been set up that are also very cumbersome to use, managing keyword strings, changing things, big challenges for analysts to make sense of that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Justina, one for you, if you can. This is a crystal ball question. You talked earlier about regulatory requirements for screening. How do you expect this to progress, and how difficult will compliance become?
Well, I think regulators are expecting more and more out of institutions, right? This is a reiterative process. We're progressing, and I think regulators are, expectations are getting higher. So I think institutions are investing more and more in compliance so that they can meet the regulatory requirements. I think Ted's example of adding a lot of predicate offenses to the most recent anti-money laundering directive is a key example, right? If you have more predicate offenses, the expectation is that you're looking for these predicate offenses. So I think, you know, the expectations just keep getting higher and higher, and it is the compliance professional's job to keep up with them and find a technology that enables them to keep up with these requirements.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask you a follow-up to that one, Justina. We're a relatively small firm, and it's hard to find time and resources for adverse media screening. Obviously, it's essential, but is it possible or even sensible to outsource some of the elements?
So I think this gets back to your risk profile, right? I mean, you might be a small firm, but if you have a lot of international business, then, you know, you should probably be doing some kind of screening. So it really goes to what type of business are you doing and how much risk are you willing to take on? You know, I think there are vendor solutions for smaller businesses, but maybe Ted and Eric can speak to that. It really is a combination of your risk profile and your risk appetite.
Okay, thank you. And Justina, coming back to our questions, let me stay with you and tell us a little bit about the benefits of a successful screening solution beyond compliance and the penalties of getting it wrong.
So we've all seen big fines, monetary penalties that are the consequences of getting it wrong. But more importantly, it's really the reputational damage, right? Sometimes these penalties may seem huge, but for certain institutions, it's a day of profit, right? Whereas the reputational risk stays with you for a long time. This reputational risk is hard to undo once it happens. So, you know, you don't want to be in the press, in an NGO report, in a UN Security Council report, because you inadvertently facilitated a transaction for a North Korean arms trafficker or human rights abuser, corrupt officials. And you don't have to do this on purpose, right? It could be inadvertent. And I had a colleague at another bank who was very frustrated because their institution ended up in a UN report because they inadvertently facilitated something they did not know about. And then that news was picked up by a lot of news media. It was almost a media pylon, and they had no idea it happened within their institution. And that's because they didn't make linkages. They didn't connect the dots between certain parties, between their client and their associates down the chain. So that's really the headline risk, the reputational risk. That is the cost of getting it wrong. And again, that is hard to undo. You know, it's not just like paying a penalty.
Okay, Eric, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think I agree also with what Ted has been saying. A lot of the smaller organizations will tend to come up with a keyword chain and use one of the free search engines and tick the quote unquote tick the box of screening. And I've seen that go horribly wrong. An example, they maybe do the first 3 pages of hits or 4 pages of hits or 7 pages of hits or sometimes 12 pages of hits. Where do you stop? And that's the problem with this process. How long is a piece of string? It's as long as your risk tolerance lets it be. You need to, as an organization, really understand what you're doing, how you're doing it, and who your customers are. And that is how you apply your screening methodology. It's not the other way around. And unfortunately, often there's an attempt to just add a bunch of keywords that will tick all of the boxes from a regulatory and a legal standpoint, maybe ethical and moral standpoint as well. And then that should be enough. And let's do the first 3 pages because anything significant will be there. And that has been shown time and time again not to be effective. And that's made worse when you have a situation where your data isn't robust and clean, and it just magnifies the disastrous outcome. I think this is important, and I think organizations understand it's important, judging by the number that have joined this webinar. However, the key is the introspection in the organization, making sure they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We're coming close to the end of the webinar now. So finally, I'd like to ask our experts to provide some advice to practitioners who are working on adverse media screening. And can I come back to you, Eric, for a few words first?
Yeah, sure. So make your operations or the operational elements of this process achievable and make sure that they're completed. So escalations are completed and appropriately resolved. Justification is done. If there's a linkage to your risk methodology so that hits only are looked at if it's medium or high, or if it's a significant hit, it can change the risk to medium or high. Just make sure that that's understood in the organization and it's applied.
Okay, lovely. Justina, what would you say?
I think my advice is less practical and more aspirational. When you are reviewing the negative news relating to a client and evaluating if the business should go forward, ask yourself not only, can I do this legally, but should I do this, right? Because even if something is legal, it's probably not worth the reputational or headline risk. And again, not out of the goodness of your own heart, but because your regulators, your clients, your investors, and your employees have come to expect not just doing what is legal, but going beyond that.
Thank you. And some final words from you, Ted.
Yeah, I would practically, for people looking to benchmark technology, I've got 5 areas that you want to focus on. So first is sources. You know, from a source inclusion criteria, where does your partner or potential partners draw the line? How are they vetting that? How are they analyzing? What's their process for ingestion of new sources? Second point, scale. So where are they looking as areas of growth? You know, from a coverage perspective, how are they including other data into the profile? So having a single profile from that risk profile that includes the entity information, sanctions information, other content. Language. So from a language perspective, how are they dealing with the multitude of languages that you're interested in? What transliteration principle do they apply? How do they do that locally? Then on the tech footing, there's matching. So what name matching principles can they share those with you? Have you understood those? Because that's a really key component, and it's going to become next couple of years much more aligned to what regulators. If you look at, for example, OFAC sanctions recently, they're very binary on looking and very granular rather on how people's name matching thresholds are configured. So do you know that, and can you impact that? And then risk relevancy. So how are they curating their content to help you to prioritize the determination of what to do? If you've got those 5 things in a checklist when speaking to vendors, and you get some good responses or some indifferent responses, there's red flags in there for you to action. And of course, we're more than welcome to talk you through those ourselves here at Ruse Analytics whenever you'd like.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise and experience. Thank you too to Bureau van Dijk and Moody's Analytics Company for sponsoring today's webinar. We did receive more audience questions than we were able to answer in this hour, so we'll send them all off to Ted. If you want to find out more from him, there will be a link on our screen towards the end of the webinar. Actually, you can see it now, I think, bbdinfo.com. So if you want to get in touch with some of the questions we haven't been able to answer today or anything else, please use that. Before we close up, just some news from A-Team Group. Last week, we launched a new content service called ESG Insight. We're very excited about it. It's obviously dedicated to all things environmental, social, and governance. You can sign up using the link on your screen. We've got news, we've got videos, we've got all sorts of things up there, and some early reports from a briefing we held last week. So sign up there and do join us there. As if you scroll down your screen to additional options, you'll see a few A-Team items that may be of interest. We've got a couple of webinars coming up, one on best practices for metadata management and another on optimizing analytics. You can also download our 2021 ESG handbook. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Justina, Ted, and Eric, and thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.